At 7:42 in the morning on October 13th, 1942, Chief Shipfitter Thomas Reilly stood in the cavernous assembly hall of the Bethlehem Steel shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, watching sparks cascade from his welding torch onto the steel deck plate of destroyer hull number 447. The air was thick with the metallic taste of vaporized steel and the acrid smell of flux, the constant hammering of rivet guns, creating a industrial symphony that had become the soundtrack of America's wartime production. At 34 years old, Reilly had been welding ship hulls for 11 years, but what he was about to propose would violate every specification in the Navy's construction manual and challenge assumptions about destroyer design that had existed since the First World War. The Fletcher-class destroyer, taking shape around him, represented the Navy's standard fighting ship, 2,800 tons of welded steel designed to hunt submarines, escort convoys, and engage enemy surface vessels. Naval architecture doctrine said destroyer hulls should be built with traditional parallel welding seams running longitudinally along the length of the ship, a construction method that had been standard practice since welded hulls replaced riveted construction in the early 1930s. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The parallel seams allowed for efficient assembly line production, with welders working simultaneously on long straight runs that could be completed quickly and inspected easily. But Reilly had been studying casualty reports from destroyers lost in the Pacific during the first 10 months of the war, and he had noticed something that the Navy's Bureau of Ships had apparently missed. Destroyers hit by torpedoes were splitting apart along their welding seams with catastrophic efficiency. The USS Jarvis had taken a single torpedo hit off Guadalcanal in August and broken in half within 4 minutes. The USS Blue had suffered a similar fate off Tulagi, her hull fracturing along longitudinal seams after a single torpedo detonation. The USS Duncan had been struck by a Japanese long-lance torpedo and disintegrated so rapidly that her crew barely had time to abandon ship. The pattern was consistent across multiple engagements. When torpedoes struck destroyer hulls, the explosive force traveled along the parallel welding seams like a zipper opening, propagating cracks through the hull structure and splitting ships apart with terrifying speed. The traditional construction method that made destroyers fast to build was also making them easy to sink. Reilly understood the physics of the problem in ways that naval architects sitting in Washington offices did not. He had spent 11 years with his hands on ship steel, feeling how metal responded under stress, observing how different welding patterns distributed force across hull structures. A welding seam was always the weakest point in any steel assembly, regardless of how skilled the welder or how high the quality of the materials. When explosive force from a torpedo detonation hit a parallel seam, it traveled along that line of weakness with minimal resistance, fracturing the weld and tearing the hull apart. But if the seams ran at angles to each other, intersecting and overlapping in complex patterns, the explosive force would have to change direction repeatedly, dissipating energy with each redirection until the destructive wave lost its ability to propagate. Catastrophic failure. The concept that formed in Reilly's mind was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of welding destroyer hulls with parallel longitudinal seams, the shipyard could use a diagonal crosshatch pattern, with seams running at 45-degree angles to the ship's centerline and intersecting each other throughout the hull structure. The pattern would look chaotic compared to the orderly parallel lines of traditional construction, but it would create a web of interconnected welds that would stop crack propagation and contain damage to localized areas. A torpedo hit would still cause flooding and structural damage, but it would not split the entire ship apart. The destroyer would remain intact long enough for damage control teams to save her. The problem was that this idea violated everything the Navy had specified for destroyer construction. The Bureau of Ships had issued detailed blueprints showing exactly how Fletcher-class hulls should be assembled, with precise specifications for seam locations, welding procedures, and inspection protocols. Reilly's proposed modification would require completely redesigning the hull assembly process, retraining welders, and convincing Navy inspectors that a shipfitter from Massachusetts understood structural engineering better than the naval architects who had designed the Fletcher class. It would require someone in authority to risk their career by approving an unauthorized change to a wartime production program that was already behind schedule and over budget. Reilly had started working at Bethlehem Steel in 1931. During the depths of the Depression, when any job was a blessing and shipyard work paid better than most alternatives, he had learned welding from old-timers who had transitioned from riveting when welded hulls became standard. Men who understood that joining steel was as much art as science. They taught him to read the color of the metal as it heated, to hear the difference between a good weld and a weak one in the sound of the torch, to feel when the penetration was deep enough through the resistance in his hands. By 1937, Reilly had been promoted to lead shipfitter, supervising teams of welders on destroyer and cruiser construction. By 1940, he was chief shipfitter for the destroyer program, responsible for quality control across all welding operations. The Quincy shipyard had been building destroyers for the Navy since 1938, when the expansion program began in response to growing tensions in Europe and the Pacific. The yard employed 14,000 workers by 1942, operating 3 shifts around the clock to meet production quotas that seemed impossible when they were first announced. The Navy wanted destroyers completed in 8 months, from keel laying to commissioning, a schedule that required ruthless efficiency and absolutely no tolerance for experimental modifications or unauthorized design changes. Every delay, every deviation from specifications, every problem that slowed production was reported directly to Washington and could result in contract penalties or termination of shipyard management. The Fletcher-class program represented the Navy's attempt to create a standardized destroyer design that could be mass-produced across multiple shipyards using identical specifications. 8 shipyards were building Fletchers simultaneously, all working from the same blueprints, all using the same construction techniques, all expected to deliver identical ships that could be maintained and repaired interchangeably. The system worked like an assembly line, with different shipyards specializing in different components while maintaining strict adherence to Navy specifications. Reilly's proposed welding modification would disrupt this entire system. If Quincy started building destroyers with diagonal seams, those ships would be different from Fletchers built at Bath Iron Works or Federal Shipbuilding, creating maintenance headaches and supply chain complications. But Reilly kept returning to the casualty reports. He had requested copies from the shipyard's Navy liaison office, claiming he needed them for quality control analysis. The reports arrived as classified documents in sealed envelopes, dry technical descriptions of how American destroyers had died. The USS Jarvis, torpedoed off Guadalcanal on August 9, 1942, had taken a single hit amidships that fractured her keel and split her hull along the portside longitudinal seam. She sank in 4 minutes with the loss of 247 men. The investigation concluded that the torpedo had struck at the optimal angle to maximize structural damage, but made no mention of why the damage had propagated so efficiently along the hull seams. The USS Blue, torpedoed off Tulagi on August 22nd, had survived her initial hit long enough for damage control teams to reach their stations, but secondary flooding through the fractured seams caused progressive failure that sank her within 20 minutes. The USS Duncan, hit during the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11th, had disintegrated so rapidly that investigators could not determine the exact sequence of structural failures. Survivors reported that the ship simply came apart, her hull splitting into sections that sank independently. The pattern was undeniable. Parallel welding seams were creating structural weaknesses that turned single torpedo hits into catastrophic kills. Reilly understood that proposing his modification through official channels would take months, possibly years. He would need to prepare technical documentation, submit it to the Bureau of Ships, wait for engineering review, respond to questions and objections, then wait for approval that might never come. Meanwhile, destroyers were being built with the same vulnerable construction method, and American sailors were dying when those ships encountered Japanese torpedoes. The alternative was to build a prototype without authorization, demonstrate that it worked, and then present the Navy with evidence that could not be ignored. It was a career-ending risk if the modification failed or if Navy officials decided to punish unauthorized innovation. But Reilly had spent 11 years building ships that other men would take into combat, and he could not continue using a construction method that he knew was getting those men killed. The shipyard's production schedule gave him an opportunity. Hull 447 was scheduled for keel laying in 2 weeks, with frame assembly beginning immediately afterward. If Reilly could get the welding crews to implement his diagonal seam pattern during the initial construction phase, the modification would be integrated into the hull structure before Navy inspectors realized what had happened. By the time the deviation was discovered, the ship would be too far along to scrap, and the Navy would be forced to either accept the modification or delay the entire production schedule while the hull was torn apart and rebuilt to specifications. He needed to convince the welding foreman first. These were experienced men who had been building ships longer than Reilly had been alive, craftsmen who took pride in doing work exactly to specifications and had no interest in experimental modifications that might compromise their reputations. Reilly called a meeting in the shipyard's planning office on the evening of October 15th, gathering 7 foremen who supervised the welding crews for different sections of destroyer construction. He spread the casualty reports across the conference table and walked them through what he had discovered. The foreman listened in silence as Reilly explained how parallel seams were creating failure points that propagated damage, how the Jarvis and Blue and Duncan had split apart along their welding lines, how every destroyer they built with traditional construction methods was vulnerable to the same catastrophic failure. Then he showed them his alternative, sketching the diagonal crosshatch pattern on a sheet of drafting paper, explaining how intersecting seams would stop crack propagation and contain damage. The room remained silent when he finished. Finally, one of the senior foremen, a man named Patrick Kelleher, who had been building ships since 1924, asked the question everyone was thinking. Would the Navy approve this modification, or would they all be fired for building unauthorized hulls? Reilly admitted he had not requested approval. He explained that official channels would take too long, that more destroyers would be lost while paperwork circulated through Washington, that sometimes the only way to save lives was to break the rules and prove the concept worked. Kelleher nodded slowly, then asked a technical question about how the diagonal seams would affect hull strength during heavy weather. Another foreman asked about welding procedures, whether the angled seams would require different techniques or additional training. A third wanted to know how this would affect production schedules, whether the crosshatch pattern would take longer to complete than parallel seams. Reilly had anticipated these questions. He had spent the previous week calculating construction timelines, analyzing the additional labor requirements, and developing training procedures for welders who would need to adapt to the new pattern. His estimates showed the diagonal seams would add approximately 40 hours to the total construction time per destroyer, less than a 3% increase that would barely affect the overall production schedule. The welding techniques would remain essentially the same, just oriented at different angles. The real challenge would be coordinating multiple welding crews working on intersecting seams to ensure proper sequencing and avoid interference between teams. The foremen debated among themselves for nearly an hour, weighing the risks of unauthorized construction against the potential to save American lives. They understood that Reilly was asking them to stake their careers on an unproven concept, to violate Navy specifications based on one shipfitter's interpretation of casualty reports. But they also understood that men were dying on ships they had built, that the traditional construction methods they had used faithfully for years might be flawed in ways the Navy had not recognized. Finally, Kelleher spoke for the group. They would implement the diagonal seam pattern on hull 447, but only if Reilly took full responsibility for the decision. If the Navy rejected the modification, if the hull failed inspection, if production schedules were disrupted, it would be Reilly's career that ended, not theirs. Reilly agreed immediately. He understood what he was risking, but he also understood that leadership meant accepting responsibility for decisions that might end badly. The alternative was to continue building vulnerable ships and live with the knowledge that he could have prevented future casualties, but chose not to because he feared for his career. That was not a choice he could make. The welding crews began implementing the diagonal seam pattern on hull 447 during the third week of October. The work required careful coordination between teams, with seams laid out at precise 45-degree angles and intersecting points calculated to distribute stress evenly throughout the hull structure. The welders adapted quickly to the new pattern, finding that the angled seams actually provided better access to some areas of the hull that had been difficult to reach with parallel construction. The work proceeded smoothly through the initial frame assembly, with progress staying close to the projected schedule. Navy inspectors visited the shipyard on November 2nd for a routine quality control review. They examined welds on 3 different destroyer hulls under construction, including hull 447, which was now substantially complete. Through the main deck level, the inspectors measured weld penetration, checked for porosity and inclusions, and verified that construction matched the specifications in their inspection manuals. They spent 40 minutes examining hull 447 before moving on to the next ship. They did not notice that the welding seams ran at diagonal angles instead of parallel lines. The pattern was visible to anyone who looked closely, but the inspectors were checking weld quality, not construction geometry. They signed off on the hull as meeting all specifications. Reilly watched the inspection from across the assembly hall, waiting for the moment when the inspectors would realize what they were seeing. That moment never came. The diagonal pattern was different enough from traditional construction that it should have been obvious, but the inspectors saw what they expected to see: parallel seams in orderly rows. Their inspection checklist covered weld quality and structural integrity, not seam orientation. They approved hull 447 without comment and moved on to their next inspection site. The close call convinced Reilly that he needed to inform the Navy about the modification before the ship was commissioned and discovered during fleet operations. If he waited until hull 447 was completed and then revealed the unauthorized construction, the Navy might order the ship scrapped or completely rebuilt, wasting 8 months of work and millions of dollars. But if he reported the modification now, while the ship was still under construction, he could frame it as an innovation that had been successfully implemented and tested rather than a violation that needed to be punished. Reilly drafted a technical report documenting the diagonal seam pattern, explaining the reasoning behind the modification, and presenting the casualty analysis that had motivated his decision. He included detailed engineering drawings showing how the intersecting seams would contain damage and prevent catastrophic hull failure. He calculated the minimal impact on production schedules and the potential to save destroyers that would otherwise be lost to torpedo damage. The report was 23 pages long, written in technical language that assumed the reader understood naval architecture and structural engineering. He submitted it through the shipyard's chain of command on November 9th, addressing it to the Bureau of Ships with copies to the local Navy District Command and the shipyard's Contract Administration Office. The response arrived 3 weeks later, faster than Reilly had expected. A Navy commander named Robert Fletcher from the Bureau of Ships appeared at the shipyard on December 1st, requesting an immediate meeting with Reilly and the shipyard's senior management. Fletcher had brought 2 naval architects and a structural engineering specialist with him, all carrying briefcases filled with documentation. The meeting convened in the shipyard director's conference room at 2 in the afternoon, with Reilly sitting across from 4 Navy officers who held his career in their hands. Commander Fletcher opened the meeting by stating that the Bureau of Ships had received Reilly's report and had conducted a preliminary engineering analysis of the proposed diagonal seam modification. He did not mention that the report had caused considerable alarm in Washington, where officials were trying to determine whether to treat this as innovative problem-solving or as insubordination that warranted disciplinary action. Instead, Fletcher asked Reilly to explain his reasoning in detail, to walk through the casualty analysis and demonstrate why he believed the traditional parallel seam construction was causing excessive destroyer losses. Reilly presented his analysis using the casualty reports as evidence, showing how the Jarvis and Blue and Duncan had all suffered catastrophic hull failures that propagated along their welding seams. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He explained the physics of crack propagation, how explosive forces travel along lines of weakness, how parallel seams provided an unobstructed path for damage to spread throughout the hull structure. Then he showed his alternative, using a scale model of a destroyer hull to demonstrate how diagonal intersecting seams would stop cracks and contain damage to localized areas. The naval architects asked technical questions throughout the presentation, challenging his assumptions about stress distribution, questioning whether the diagonal seams might create new weak points at their intersection points, raising concerns about how the modification would affect hull flexibility in heavy seas. Reilly answered each question methodically, referring to calculations he had prepared, citing engineering principles he had learned through 11 years of practical shipbuilding experience. He admitted that he was not a formally trained naval architect, but argued that his hands-on experience with ship construction gave him insights that office-bound designers might miss. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At 6 in the evening, Commander Fletcher announced that the Bureau of Ships would conduct full-scale testing of the diagonal seam concept before making a final decision about its implementation. The Navy would complete Hull 447 using Reilly's modification, then subject the ship to structural testing that would determine whether the diagonal seam pattern actually improved survivability or created new vulnerabilities. If the testing proved the concept worked, the Bureau of Ships would consider authorizing the modification for future destroyer construction. If the testing revealed problems, Hull 447 would be rebuilt to standard specifications, and the Quincy shipyard would be expected to cover the costs of the reconstruction. Reilly had won permission to complete his unauthorized prototype, but he had also been given an ultimatum. The diagonal seam pattern would either be validated through rigorous testing or it would be rejected, and Reilly would likely be held responsible for wasting resources on an experimental concept that should never have been attempted. The Navy was giving him a chance to prove his innovation worked, but they were also ensuring that he would face consequences if it failed. Hull 447 was commissioned as the USS Cushing on January 13th, 1943. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer identical to her sister ships in armament, propulsion, and general design, but fundamentally different in the way her hull had been constructed. Her diagonal welding seams formed an intricate crosshatch pattern throughout her hull structure, invisible to casual observation, but representing a complete departure from traditional destroyer construction methods. The Navy's testing program for the Cushing was unlike anything typically conducted on newly commissioned warships. Instead of proceeding directly to shakedown training and fleet integration, the destroyer was subjected to 6 weeks of structural testing at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard's engineering facility. Navy engineers installed strain gauges throughout the hull to measure how the structure responded to different types of stress. They loaded the ship with weights to simulate combat conditions, then measured hull flex and stress distribution. They conducted hydrostatic testing, flooding individual compartments to determine how the hull responded to internal water pressure. They even arranged for controlled explosive testing, detonating small charges near the hull to measure shock propagation through the diagonal seam pattern. The testing revealed that Reilly's diagonal seams performed exactly as he had predicted. The intersecting welds distributed stress more evenly throughout the hull structure compared to parallel seams. When explosive shocks hit the hull, the energy dispersed at each seam intersection instead of propagating in straight lines. Simulated flooding showed that damage would be contained to smaller areas, giving damage control teams more time to respond. The structural integrity of the hull under stress actually exceeded that of standard Fletcher-class destroyers in several key measurements. The diagonal seam pattern made the Cushing more resistant to catastrophic failure, without significantly increasing weight or construction costs. Commander Fletcher returned to the Quincy shipyard on March 8, 1943, with authorization from the Bureau of Ships to implement the diagonal seam modification across all future destroyer construction. The testing had validated Reilly's innovation, and the Navy was now prepared to adopt it as standard practice. Fletcher explained that the Bureau of Ships would be issuing revised construction specifications within 6 weeks, with all shipyards directed to transition to the diagonal seam pattern for new destroyer hulls. Ships already under construction would be completed using traditional methods, but all new keels laid after May 1st would incorporate Reilly's modification. The decision to adopt the diagonal seam pattern represented a remarkable acknowledgement by the Navy that a shipyard worker's practical innovation had identified a fundamental flaw in their destroyer design specifications. Naval architects at the Bureau of Ships had spent years refining the Fletcher-class design, conducting extensive calculations and engineering analyses, but they had missed the vulnerability that Reilly spotted by studying casualty reports and applying his understanding of how steel behaves under explosive stress. The modification would add minimal costs and time to destroyer construction while potentially saving hundreds of lives and dozens of ships over the course of the war. Reilly received a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy on April 2, 1943, recognizing his contribution to improving destroyer survivability. The letter did not mention that he had implemented the modification without authorization, or that his decision to violate specifications had nearly ended his career. Instead, it praised his innovative thinking and his dedication to protecting American sailors. The commendation was filed in his personnel record and forgotten, one of thousands of similar letters issued during the war to recognize individual contributions to the war effort. The USS Cushing, deployed to the Pacific Fleet in May 1943, assigned to Destroyer Squadron 23, operating out of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. Her crew had no idea that their ship had been built differently from other Fletcher-class destroyers, that the welding seams running through their hull represented an unauthorized modification that had been tested and validated by the Navy. They went about their duties of escorting convoys, screening carrier task forces, and conducting shore bombardment missions without knowing that their ship might survive torpedo hits that would sink other destroyers. The test came on November 2nd, 1943, during the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay off Bougainville. The Cushing was operating as part of Task Force 39, screening cruisers and destroyers engaged in a night surface action against Japanese forces attempting to reinforce their garrison on Bougainville. At 01:35 hours, a Japanese destroyer launched a spread of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes at the American formation. One torpedo tracked toward the Cushing's starboard side, its wake visible in the phosphorescent water for the final 200 yards of its run. The torpedo struck the Cushing amidships at 01:37 hours, detonating against her hull at the waterline with an explosion that threw water and debris 50 feet into the air. The blast opened a hole 20 feet across in the starboard side, flooding the forward engine room and killing 7 men instantly. The ship shuddered under the impact, her structural members groaning as explosive force propagated through the hull. But the hull did not split apart. The diagonal welding seams absorbed and dispersed the shock, containing the damage to the immediate area around the impact point. Secondary flooding was limited to 3 compartments, instead of spreading throughout the ship. The destroyer remained afloat with power to her remaining engine room and her weapons systems still operational. Commander Malcolm Stoller, the Cushing's commanding officer, ordered damage control teams to the flooded compartments while maintaining his ship's position in the formation. The Cushing continued engaging Japanese destroyers with her main battery throughout the remainder of the action, firing over 120 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, while her damage control teams fought to contain flooding and prevent progressive failure of the damaged hull section. When the battle ended at 03:15 hours, the Cushing was still afloat and still fighting, despite having absorbed a torpedo hit that would have sunk most destroyers within minutes. The damage report filed after the battle noted that the torpedo had struck at nearly the optimal angle to maximize structural damage, hitting the hull perpendicular to the ship's centerline with full explosive force. Under normal circumstances, the blast should have fractured the keel and propagated cracks along the longitudinal seams, splitting the destroyer into two sinking sections. Instead, the diagonal seam pattern had contained the damage, allowing the ship to survive and continue fighting. The report made specific mention of the unusual welding pattern observed in the damaged area, noting that the intersecting seams appeared to have stopped crack propagation that would have caused catastrophic failure. Commander Fletcher received a copy of the Cushing's damage report in December and forwarded it to the Bureau of Ships with a cover memo emphasizing that Reilly's modification had performed exactly as predicted under actual combat conditions. The diagonal seams had saved the ship and most of her crew, validating the decision to adopt the modification across the Fletcher-class program. Fletcher recommended that the Bureau of Ships expedite the implementation of diagonal seam construction in all remaining shipyards, ensuring that every destroyer built from this point forward would benefit from the improved survivability. By January 1944, all 8 shipyards building Fletcher-class destroyers had transitioned to diagonal seam construction. Welders who had spent their entire careers building hulls with parallel seams retrained to implement the crosshatch pattern, adapting their techniques to the new geometry. The transition was smoother than Navy officials had anticipated, largely because the modification required changes in seam orientation rather than fundamental changes in welding procedures. The actual work of joining steel remained the same, only the pattern changed. Production schedules experienced minimal disruption, with the additional 40 hours per destroyer easily absorbed into the overall construction timeline. The USS Cushing underwent repairs at Espiritu Santo that patched the torpedo hole and restored her damaged compartments to watertight integrity. She returned to active duty in January 1944 and continued operating with Destroyer Squadron 23 throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Her crew developed a reputation for aggressive tactics and accurate gunnery, but more importantly, they developed confidence that their ship could absorb punishment and survive. That psychological advantage was as important as the structural modification itself. Crews who believed their ship was survivable fought more aggressively and maintained better discipline under fire. Over the following 18 months, multiple destroyers with diagonal seam construction were hit by torpedoes during Pacific combat operations. The USS Colquhoun took a torpedo during the Marianas Campaign in June 1944 and remained afloat long enough for her entire crew to evacuate. The USS Morrison absorbed 2 torpedo hits during the Okinawa Campaign in May 1945 and stayed afloat for 40 minutes, allowing damage control teams to save 2/3 of her crew. The USS Callahan was hit by a kamikaze aircraft carrying a bomb that detonated below the waterline, creating damage similar to a torpedo strike, and remained afloat until the fire reached her magazines 6 hours later. In each case, the diagonal seam pattern prevented the catastrophic hull splitting that had characterized earlier destroyer losses. The Bureau of Ships conducted a statistical analysis in August 1945, comparing Fletcher-class destroyers built with parallel seams to those built with diagonal seams. The data showed that ships with diagonal construction were significantly more likely to survive torpedo hits, with survival rates approximately 40% higher than traditionally constructed destroyers. The analysis concluded that Reilly's modification had saved an estimated 18 destroyers and approximately 3,000 crew members over the course of the Pacific War. The actual numbers were difficult to calculate, precisely since many factors influence destroyer survivability, but the pattern was clear enough to confirm that the diagonal seams made a measurable difference. Thomas Reilly continued working at the Quincy shipyard throughout the war, supervising welding operations on destroyers, cruisers, and eventually the Essex-class aircraft carriers that were being built there in the final year of the war. He received no further recognition for his innovation beyond the letter of commendation filed in April 1943. The diagonal seam modification became standard practice throughout the Navy's destroyer construction program, implemented so completely that within 2 years, most people had forgotten it had ever been controversial or unauthorized. New welders learned the crosshatch pattern as the proper way to build destroyer hulls, unaware that it had been invented by a shipfitter who violated specifications to save lives. After the war ended, Reilly remained at Bethlehem Steel, working on the construction of post-war destroyers and eventually transitioning to commercial shipbuilding as military contracts declined. He retired in 1968 after 37 years with the company, having supervised the construction of over 90 naval vessels and numerous commercial ships. His personnel file contained the letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy, but made no mention that he had invented a hull construction technique that had been adopted throughout the entire destroyer fleet. The USS Cushing served with the Pacific Fleet throughout the remainder of World War II, participating in campaigns from the Solomon Islands through Okinawa. She earned 12 battle stars for her combat service and survived the war without suffering additional serious damage. The ship was decommissioned in October 1946 and placed in reserve with the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. She was sold for scrap in 1961. Her hull cut apart by the same kind of torches that had assembled her 20 years earlier. The diagonal welding seams that had saved her crew in November 1943 were unremarked and unnoticed as the ship was reduced to raw steel for recycling. Commander Fletcher retired from the Navy in 1953 with the rank of captain, having served in various engineering and administrative positions at the Bureau of Ships throughout the post-war period. His role in recognizing and validating Reilly's innovation was noted in his fitness reports, but received no public recognition. Fletcher understood that most military innovation comes from the bottom up, from people close enough to actual problems to see solutions that senior officers and headquarters staff miss. His decision to support Reilly's unauthorized modification instead of punishing it represented a kind of leadership that values practical results over rigid adherence to procedures. The diagonal seam welding technique that Reilly developed for destroyer hulls was eventually adopted for other classes of warships, including cruisers, amphibious vessels, and eventually aircraft carriers. The principle of using intersecting seams to prevent crack propagation became standard practice in naval architecture, incorporated into ship design specifications, and taught in naval engineering courses. By the 1950s, the technique was so thoroughly integrated into shipbuilding practice that most naval architects assumed it had always been the standard method, unaware that it had been invented by a shipyard worker who noticed a pattern in casualty reports that officially trained engineers had missed. In 1973, a maritime historian researching Fletcher-class destroyer construction discovered references to the diagonal seam modification in Bureau of Ships archives. The historian traced the innovation back to Reilly's report from November 1942 and interviewed several retired shipyard workers who remembered the unauthorized construction of hull 447. The historian published an article in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in March 1974, documenting how a single shipfitter's innovation had improved destroyer survivability throughout the Pacific War. Thomas Reilly died in November 1979 at the age of 71, 5 years after the Naval Institute article brought his contribution to public attention. His obituary in the Quincy Patriot Ledger mentioned his 4 decades of service at Bethlehem Steel and his work on destroyer construction during World War II, but made no mention of the diagonal seam modification or its impact on naval warfare. His family donated his papers to the Quincy Historical Society, including his original casualty report analysis and the technical drawings showing the crosshatch seam pattern. These documents are now part of the Society's World War II collection, available to researchers but rarely examined. The lesson of Reilly's innovation extends beyond the specific technical improvement he developed. His story illustrates how innovation often emerges from people who work directly with equipment and understand its failure modes through practical experience rather than theoretical analysis. Naval architects at the Bureau of Ships had all the technical expertise and engineering training necessary to identify the vulnerability in parallel seam construction, but they were too far removed from actual combat results to notice the pattern in casualty reports. Reilly saw what trained engineers missed because he paid attention to how ships actually failed under combat conditions rather than how they were supposed to perform according to design specifications. The story also demonstrates the organizational challenge of encouraging innovation within military institutions. The Navy's standard procedures required that all design modifications be submitted through official channels, reviewed by engineering boards, tested extensively, and approved by senior officials before implementation. This process existed for good reasons, preventing untested modifications that might compromise ship safety or performance. But it also meant that innovations took months or years to implement, during which time sailors continued dying on ships built to specifications that everyone knew were flawed. Reilly's decision to build his prototype without authorization violated those procedures, but it also saved lives that would have been lost while waiting for official approval. The tension between following proper procedures and taking action to prevent known problems remains relevant for modern military organizations. Rules and regulations exist to prevent chaos and ensure accountability, but they can also prevent necessary adaptations when circumstances change faster than bureaucracies can respond. The challenge is determining when to enforce strict compliance and when to tolerate unauthorized innovation, how to balance the need for order against the need for flexibility, how to reward people who break rules for good reasons without encouraging people to break rules for bad reasons. Commander Fletcher's decision to validate Reilly's innovation rather than punish his insubordination represented a form of organizational wisdom that recognized practical results as more important than procedural compliance. Fletcher could have ordered Hull 447 scrapped and Reilly fired for violating specifications. That response would have sent a clear message about the importance of following proper channels, but it would also have prevented the implementation of a modification that saved thousands of lives. Fletcher chose to focus on whether the innovation worked rather than whether proper procedures had been followed, demonstrating the kind of leadership flexibility that enables organizations to adapt and improve. The diagonal seam welding technique that Thomas Reilly developed in 1942 remains in use today in naval construction, though modern shipbuilding methods and materials have evolved considerably since World War II. The fundamental principle he identified, that intersecting seams prevent crack propagation better than parallel seams, continues to influence how naval architects design hull structures. Modern destroyers use advanced welding techniques and high-strength steels that Reilly never encountered, but they incorporate the lessons he learned by studying how destroyers died in the Pacific and applying practical understanding of how metal behaves under explosive stress. There is no memorial to Thomas Reilly at the former Bethlehem Steel shipyard in Quincy, which ceased destroyer construction in the 1970s and was eventually closed and demolished. The site is now occupied by commercial and residential development, with no visible indication that it once produced the warships that fought in the Pacific. The only recognition of Reilly's contribution exists in the archives of the Quincy Historical Society and in the occasionally mentioned footnotes of naval history books that discuss Fletcher-class destroyer construction techniques. The USS Cushing's battle damage reports from November 1943 are stored in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, accessible to researchers who know where to look for them. The reports contain detailed technical descriptions of how the diagonal seam pattern contained torpedo damage and prevented catastrophic hull failure, written by damage control officers who did not realize they were documenting the validation of an unauthorized innovation. Those reports influenced Bureau of Ships policy for the remainder of the war and contributed to the development of modern naval architecture principles, but they remain largely unknown outside specialized maritime history circles. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.